This weekend, our theme is the presence of God in our lives. How does he come to us? And what is that experience like? As we all are so very different and we have different lives, so our experience of the good, the true, the beautiful God comes to us in a variety of different ways. Let's look at a few of them. The first reading, absolutely gorgeous reading from the prophet Isaiah. Here, the prophet talks about the beautiful temple in Jerusalem, an extraordinary building, adorned in gold and jewels. It's just overwhelming to the average Jewish person who is called to make at least one pilgrimage throughout their lives to Jerusalem to worship in the temple. Most Jews at the time were very poor. They didn't live very long. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of resources. And so when they made their pilgrimage to the temple, it just was this overwhelming experience. They rejoiced greatly. Well, anyway, the prophet is talking about the presence of God in the temple. He describes it as sort of a smoky experience, a sort of fiery experience, that you can feel the awesomeness of the transcendent God in this holy place. Some of us have experienced that when we've gone into a church, especially during a ceremony or during a mass or during some kind of prayer service. We feel like otherworldly. Now, for the Jewish people, years before this reading happens, they have sinned through idolatry. And there was that dramatic displacement of God. He leaves the temple. And then when they get their spiritual act together, God comes during this time to fill the place with his awesomeness. The second reading is equally, I think, dramatic, but in a different way. We hear the story of the conversion of St. Paul. Let's look at his life for a moment. Before he became St. Paul, he was Saul. He was a fantastic, well-educated scholar of the law. He was a Pharisee. He was trained from a very young age by the best rabbi around. Under his tutelage, Paul learned every aspect of the law. He was committed to it. He was a person who knew many different languages, again, very bright in the ways of the Jewish faith, and he was in line to become one of the 70 chosen members of the Sanhedrin, the ruling body at the time, kind of like our, say, Supreme Court or a member of the Congress. Very select people. And so he believed strongly in the law, and that anyone who abrogated the law or moved away from it or compromised it wasn't living the true Jewish faith. Of course, we meet Saul when he is persecuting the early church right after the death of Jesus. He was dragging people out of their homes. He was torturing them, persecuting them, even responsible for killing them, like the first martyr of the church, St. Stephen. Well, he was on his way to Damascus to continue his persecution of the early church when he heard those words from the clouds, from Jesus saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" That voice of Jesus identifying himself with those under the persecution of Saul himself, and those Pharisees who were hurting the early church and its people. Well, out of nowhere, this voice he hears, and he is blinded. Scales come over his eyes, and for a little while he is in total darkness. Then he receives a vision from God that he is to meet with the early members of the church and be baptized, and he will become, after baptism, One of the greatest theologians of the early church, his letters in the New Testament, I think there are 7 of them, are addressed to churches that Paul found in the Roman Empire all along the Mediterranean Sea. These letters give comfort and compassion to a people who are beginning to come to understand their lives in Jesus Christ and how to live good and holy lives. Of course, Paul himself is going to be persecuted, tortured by the Romans, and eventually he is going to be beheaded in Rome, where his bones now are. Paul, who was a persecutor of the church, ends up becoming one of the great saints of the church. Clearly, the presence of the Lord came to him in a very dramatic way as well. But how about the gospel? The gospel might speak to us also who feel the presence of the God in a communal setting through the words and actions of people around us. So we look at the life of St. Peter. Now, St. Peter, of course, is a fisherman, and there's this episode in which he goes out and he fishes all night long, and of course he doesn't catch anything. Then at dawn, the beginning of a new day, Jesus comes to him on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. What's interesting is 3 things that happen. One is Jesus doesn't ask for an invitation to get into St. Peter's boat. He just gets in the boat. And then he starts ordering him around. He says, Peter, put out your boat. Put it out into the depths. And of course, Peter, the fisherman, says, Master, we've tried all night long. We haven't caught anything. But he follows Jesus' command and he puts out his boat, which is very interesting. Same way it could happen in our lives. Jesus comes into our lives. He doesn't wait for an invitation. He just breaks into our ordinary existence. And then what happens? That represents God breaking into our lives, his grace, his love, which is before anything that we say or do, he comes into our lives. The question is are we going to cooperate with him? Are we going to put our boats out into the depths? Are we going to risk a little bit with Jesus? Or are we just going to sort of hug the coastlines of our lives, safe and comfortable, but kind of boring lives? Which leads me to the second point. You know, when Peter puts out his boat and then Jesus says, lower your nets to catch a level of fish. You know, are we willing to experience abundance in our lives? Some of us live with this idea that life is just supposed to be scarce, you know, just sort of supposed to be, well, we just get through our lives. There's nothing special about our lives. It's kind of sad. I think that's what sin is all about. Sin is kind of boring. Sin looks attractive, but in the end, it's an action or a behavior that really lacks the fullness of life. So the second point I'd like to make is that when we do put ourselves out there with Jesus, we should expect abundance. You know, when Simon Peter puts out his net, what does he do? He catches so many fish that when he hauls it into his boat, the boat is at risk of sinking. And then he needs help from other people, which is my third point. The third point is when we're hooked into grace, when we're hooked into Jesus' life, when we put ourselves out there with Jesus, we not only should expect abundance in our lives, but people are attracted to our way of life with Jesus. You know, we hear in the story of St. Peter that the other boats have to come over and they too are filled to the brim, almost sinking. You know, when we're living with Jesus, other people are attracted to us. People are not attracted to negative people who look at what's not there, or they complain all the time, or they don't see any good in life. They're attracted to a positive message. And I think that's what Christianity can offer the world, is something different, something positive, something filled with potentiality, something brimming over, like the boats with all the fish in it, right? That's our mission, is to go out into the depths and to experience the fullness of life, and then try to bring people to Jesus so that they can experience the abundance of life. Now, here at the high school that I work at, Judge, there's an abundance. There's an abundance of great, great students here, and faculty and staff that encourage each other to experience life in abundance, to risk, and yet there's still a net there for us to catch them, so that they can grow in their gifts and their talents, so that when they go out into the world, they can bring this positive energy, and that through their actions and their words, many more people will come to know the goodness of life that is with Jesus. And so, whether it's with the prophet Isaiah in the temple with that mysterious experience of God, whether it's the dramatic experience of St. Paul on the road to Damascus, which he completely changes his life from violence to love, or whether it's through the words and actions of a community as painted out with the first Pope, St. Peter, we can experience God in so many different ways, in so beautiful and abundant ways. May we be great witnesses to God, to each other, and to the world. God bless.